Welcome to Conversations on Teaching and Spirituality. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. At the producer's desk is Carly Hollinsby. Paul Myrie is the sound engineer as well as the composer for the music which frames our broadcast. This is the first of a three-part conversation on issues of teaching and spirituality. Specifically, we are focusing on Howard Thurman's article entitled The Sound of the Genuine. Please note that the entire Thurman article, The Sound of the Genuine, can be found on the Wabash Center website. Our conversation for this episode is Recognizing the Sound of the Genuine. My conversation partners are my marvelous colleagues and my friends. First, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Amy G. Oden. Dr. Oden is professor of early church history and spirituality. She is an independent scholar currently teaching for several seminaries. She has served on faculties of Oklahoma City University, St. Paul School of Theology, and Wesley Theological Seminary, where she also served as dean. Her most recent book is entitled Right Here, Right Now, The Practice of Christian Mindfulness. Amy is a longtime participant and leader with the Wabash Center. Welcome, Amy, to the conversation.
Thanks. It's a blessing to be here.
And our second conversation partner is Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith. Dr. Smith serves as assistant professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. Shively's publications include Strangers to Family, Diaspora, and First Peter's Invention of God's Household with Baylor University Press. Shively is currently completing a commentary on 2 Peter for SBL Press. Dr. Smith is a sought-after womanist voice in church and scholarly circles. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me. So glad to be here with you.
Learning to recognize the sound of the genuine requires so much consideration, so much imagination, requires, I think, a sharpening of skills, a sharpening of practices. And that's why we're here together, a little help from your friends. So thank you, sisters, for joining this conversation.
Absolutely.
So let us begin with a brief reading of Howard Thurman and from the article. Thurman writes, "There is in every person something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in herself. There is in you something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. Nobody like you has ever been born. No one like you will ever be born again. You are the only one. And if you miss the sound of the genuine in you, you will be a cripple all the rest of your life because you will never be able to get a scent on who you are." Then just a bit farther into the article, Thurman continues, "So the burden of what I have to say to you is, what is your name? Who are you? And can you find a way to hear the sound of the genuine in yourself? There are so many noises going on inside of you, so many echoes of all sorts, so many internalizing of the rumble and the traffic, the confusions, the disorders by which your environment is peopled, that I wonder if you can get still enough, not quiet enough, still enough to hear rumbling up from your unique and essential idiom, the sound of the genuine in you. I don't know if you can," says Thurman, "but this is your assignment." Ooh, Amy and Shively, Amy and Shively. This is what Dr. Thurman has left us.
What is your name?
What is your name? So that's a huge lifelong quest, lifelong journey, the quest of identity, right? The quest of identity. Who are you? What is your name?
Yeah.
So help us understand the quest of that, particularly for scholars of religion and scholars of theology.
And especially when the world wants to name you, right? The world wants to tell you who you are, or the guild wants to tell you who you are, or, right? And so we absorb all these names that are sort of imposed. And so his invitation to really identify our name, I mean, that's the work, right? Of sort of, and sometimes it's archaeological, right? Digging and out from underneath all that.
Mm-hmm. I love your image of the fact that we're absorbing the names, the others are putting on to us. And then the idea that, okay, before I start absorbing and taking that in, I need to have some sort of statements for myself about who I am, what it is I'm trying to do, as a way to not just absorb, but I like to talk about it as to sift the possibilities. I mean, what I find so powerful about the sound of the genuine is the way in which there are so many possibilities that each and every one of us have in terms of who we can be, what we can do, and we get to have the first say on what that is for us, what's a first order, second order, and to begin to sift these names and possibilities by first starting with me.
And do you think that changes over your lifetime, Shively? Or do you think Thurman is saying there's some deeply authentic naming that doesn't change? Or is your sense that even knowing my name, it might change?
Yeah, so you're naming where I always struggle. So depending on the season, sometimes I think that Thurman, and depending on what I'm reading, sometimes I think Thurman does think that there's something very authentic and singular that's deep within each one of us that makes us who we are, that makes me Shively. Like that's just that. But then when you read on, he believes in the power of evolution and and that the work that our encounters with the earth and with each other, our relationships, our locations have on us to transform us. And to do new things with us, to set us off in new paths. So that is a moving answer for me. I'm unclear actually right now on whether Thurman on either or. Almost, can I have both of them and say
I was going to
sometimes?
say, I think it's both. I think we have a core, an essence, a name, a fingerprint, right?
I love
that we know ourselves. We hope to need to figure out who, and then our names also change, right? So if you call my house and ask for Nancy Westfield, you don't know me very well because all my friends and people who know me call me Lynn, right? So my family name is Lynn. My mother's name was Nancy. My great-grandmother's name. We were a household full of women who were Nancy. I was Lynn. So it depends on who you are and in what setting your name is. And it's not derogatory, right? It just depends on where you are. But then I also think of the spiritual. I told Jesus it would be okay to change my name, right? So for those of us who come up as marginalized people through myriad of oppressions, who've been called out our names, right? They called me out my name, right? Being called boy or gal or, other assorted B words, right?
Right.
To think that when we get to heaven, that part of that salvific experience is to have our name changed by someone who loves us, by the divine, by the person, the entity that knows us the deepest and with the best love.
I love that image of fingerprint. I mean, to hear you say it, Lynn, Thurman uses that in some of his meditative writings, the image of the fingerprint of the person. So that's really, I'm hearing it say, yeah, that's actually language he reaches for to try to name this sound, this genuineness of us that's potent. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I often experience it as a routing, like that holds my life in the midst of storms, changes, and so like anything organic from season to season, it may look a little different, right? There's not the exact same flower that blooms from the plant year after year, right? It's never exactly the same, but that rootedness somehow it feels that my naming, right, who I most truly am, has that kind of rooting function.
So, and continuing with that metaphor, season to season, there are different obstacles. There's rocks and there's wind and there's drought and there's children who stepped on you while they were playing, and there's all the the kinds of things that Thurman calls noise and echoes and confusions, right? So sometimes you do lose track of or can't hear the sound of the genuine because of the clatter and the clamor.
Right. And the imposing. I mean, so the one thing that is resonating with me is this notion of what it means to hear Thurman call you to sort of name what to ask you to answer the question, what is your name yourself, especially from locations where we're used to that naming, like you said, being imposed on us. I mean, the sound of the genuine is really the baccalaureate address that he's making to Spelman College, so HBCU, African American Women's College, at the very beginning of the 1980s. And his opening challenge is for them to name themselves. As they're graduating, your task, your first task, is to name yourself as you go into the world. Why? Because you're going into the world that already has made up its mind about all kinds of names, and the way you fight that is going into that with clarity about, like you said, that what it is you're bringing, building on, expanding, deepening. I love this, Amy. Rooting, this rootedness of you is so very, very important.
But I think, especially younger scholar and professor, I was very tempted, I think, by, and this may be an obstacle, Lynn, tempted or be convinced even by some of those external naming, right? I mean, when I entered my own discipline, there just weren't very many women in it in the 70s and 80s. And so I really thought my name needed to, and, you know, my persona, my being, you know, to somehow conform to the norm that I saw in my guild or the norm that I saw in the classroom. And I think that can be an obstacle, and that, you know, then I think we can all get really confused about what is genuine, because surely it can't be genuine just to be myself. Like, that's not enough.
That's right. It's not enough. It's not good enough. It's not high enough. It's not wide enough. It's not deep enough. And to think that educational institutions use the normativity of conformity to shape people should be disturbing to us. That when we come through these degree programs, especially the PhD program, and shaped into mini-me's of whoever we studied with and whoever mentored us, we have been done a disservice. That it should never be formation to shape you into conformity of someone else other than who you are. That we should try to shape educational programs that make you the most genuine self you can be, not strip you of who you are and what you are.
Yeah, and I think the context in which Thurman poses the question is a way to begin. It's the way to do that. So in a field and in a formation that has taught us to be about our sort of individual scholarly work and voice and presence and persona and identity, I think it's something to say that he poses the question to the entirety of the graduating class. If this is work that you do not just individually, but even when it's individual and personal, it's in community with others who are all sitting there wrestling together with the question of, what is my name and what is myself? No, we're not trying to be duplicates of each other and imitations of each other, but we are trying to create space for each person to ask the question of, what is your name? And then this is the piece, maybe even to experiment and try out what those possibilities are.
That's right.
And I think that's where so many of our students are, right? In the classroom, undergraduate or graduate, right? They're trying on those names, and they may have not even been given permission to listen, right, for their own name. You know what, in that excerpt, Lynn, to get still enough to listen. And most of our students have never had the kind of practices or structures for that. So I think it can be a really rich exploration.
I think many of our students haven't had the structures for that, nor have they been introduced to the notion that who you are can be heard inside of yourself. Right? Most of us have been told that if you hear something inside of yourself, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
We take the parapsychological, twist and say, you're not supposed to hear voices inside of yourself. Thurman is saying that something other than that. Thurman is saying, listen for the genuine voice inside of yourself. That's, in many ways, then and now, countercultural.
Yeah. And and then he says it and invite and uses images. Like, I mean, so one of the things I love about Thurman's writings, period, is the way in which he piles on metaphor after metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. And sometimes, like in this case, I feel like he's giving, it's almost like one of those reels. Well, does this work for you? Is this what you're hearing? Is this what you're hearing? Are you hearing running water? Are you hearing a sea? Are you hearing an ocean? I mean, like, he's piling on images of possibilities for you to try on, to try to articulate and name what it is you're hearing. And I think that's a part of the experimenting work, the correct courage of the naming, is to say, yeah, it's kind of like this, but not exactly. And we keep looking for ways to articulate that which is deeply within us. Here's a piece I just wanted to build off that. I find it difficult for us to ask our students to inhabit space and try on space that we, as the teachers or facilitators or guides, however way we conceive of ourselves and our teaching selves, are unwilling to, unable to, uncomfortable with doing ourselves. So to want this for the students, and we ourselves are not doing it with, I would even say with them, makes it difficult for anyone to find that sound. So I keep coming back to, how are we setting up, even in our classroom and our teaching work, the communities of, it's like listening for sound, for that inner sound.
Well, and students know who's genuine. I mean, there's no mistake that Howard used the term genuine.
Yeah.
Right. Students know in their own classrooms and their own educational experience who's genuine and who is not. What teachers are standing up there in front of them without good intent, without love or integrity, or the ability to coax out of people what is the best for them, and instead inflict harm, inflict pain, inflict violence in these spaces called classrooms. Students know who those people are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess it is, Shively, as you were describing, I thought it's disingenuous, right? The opposite of it's disingenuous to invite students into spaces that we're not willing to inhabit. But we also know, for so many faculty, the academy hasn't been a place to listen to their own voice. And so I do, but I do think, as we kind of move out of a lot of the epistemologies of the modern world of colonial, as we move into I think some more robust views of knowing and of understanding, I'm very hopeful we're shifting out of that. But I do think it takes courage and clarity to trust and kind of own those spaces and those conversations.
Yeah. I find myself more and more reframing what the classroom is for me as I walk in. So I think a place where I really struggled initially was trying to, again, identify the sound of the genuine. I love how you use this mini me's, many me's, Lynn. Like, okay, I'm not a mini me of my professors of shape. How do I become, how do I stand as Shively T.J. Smith professor in the space? And one of the ways that's been very liberating for me, for trying to create the sound for myself and for my students, is to reframe what the classroom is for me and all that. So one of the standard ways in which I do that now is I talk about it as, this is an intellectual experiment. I used to be a swimmer too. So sometimes I'll say, we're taking an intellectual lap, right? It may be a good lap, or we may not make it, right? But it is an experiment that may work well or may not. And so then for me, it has started freeing me up from the class, even the daily class or weekly class, being something that is executed perfectly, that every single date and moment that needed to be named is named and noted, but really to create space for all of us to be experimenting with thinking this way, trying on this idea, trying on this moment for ourselves, for the world, thinking through the implications of it. So I wonder if some of the work of this, some of this work of teaching and spirituality, is also thinking about how we need to reframe the spaces that we find ourselves teaching in, and the space engaging in, so that we can be free and, like you say, have the courage to listen for the sound and try out different ways of articulating it for ourselves and for our students to also do that work.
And did it take you, Shively, to a certain number of years with, in your career before you got to that place of revisioning the classroom? Something you kind of always wanted to do and then finally felt free enough to? Is there a development here that we can name?
I think one was, as much as I love to teach, I always find it at one of the most contested spaces I find myself in, because it doesn't matter. Most people, I mean, particularly in my field, most people are not accustomed to coming into a biblical studies course. Then I am not the embodiment that they are imagining. It's going to be the scholar and the professor of record. For whatever reason, we know all that history. And so I always come in recognizing that there's other things that are happening in the room. How do I make it okay for me to accidentally mix up a date that I know well, but because we're moving so, like, how do I make it safe for me to not just be scholar and professor, but human in the space, and then that doesn't unleash you know attack or terror for myself, let alone other students. And so I want it to be okay for me to come in and be a thinking, processing, on my toes person. And so that's sort of how I got there. I got there trying to think about what it means to create it, make the space safe for me to do the work Thurman said elsewhere that makes me come alive. And then hopefully that makes other people come alive. So yeah, I think it was a journey. It also is I think the last thing I would say, it is kind of, I'm going to use a real technical and scholarly word now, scary. To decide that you want to do something different in the spaces that you were trained to do in a particular way by people, quite frankly, that you might have really deep respect from, you did well under, you learned under, you flourished under, or not. I mean, whatever those. And then to say, yeah, I want to frame this space entirely different, and I have no models for it other than I'm listening to the sound of the genuine in myself telling me that this has to be a different space.
So I think that listening for the sound of the genuine, that whatever we can listen inside of ourselves is also the way we listen outside of ourselves. So if you are a shallow listener inside of yourself, you are likely to be a shallow listener to your students, to the circumstances around you outside of yourself. Right. So one of the things we say in teaching is listen to your students, listen to your students. And I remember being taught that. And I remember also asking then in return, well, what am I listening for? What? But it is a journey to figure out how to listen on the outside as much as on the inside, how to hear what they're saying in their conversation and in the spaces between their conversations, right? So when I think of my own evolution, I'm thinking about the question, Amy, that you asked Shively. I think of myself, the more I move toward my own artistry, the more I move to, as a teacher, my own artistry as a teacher, my own notion of improvisation as a teacher. When I have to, in playing, listen to the notes around me to be able to play my instrument, I'm also, as a teacher, listening to the learners, trying to figure out, where do I come in? Where do I sit out? Where do I invite them in? Where do they need to create spaces? All those kinds of things. To me, it's about creativity, imagination, artistry. Nobody ever said to me when I was training to teach, you need to be more of your artistic self.
Right. Yes.
So we are saying that today. You need to be more of your artistic self.
Right.
to improve your own teaching, to be a better do better critical reflection on your own teaching and the dynamics that are happening in your own classroom.
And so often, if we will go back to our original desire to go into a PhD program, to be a scholar, to be a professor, to be in the classroom and get the privilege of, hanging out with students, discovering new things, right? That original, whether it was a sense of call or a sense of excitement, a sense of aliveness, as Thurman would say, what makes you come alive, right? I think that is a location to identify the genuine, to identify what you were just talking about, Lynn, the artistry or whatever those early. And so often we go through a process of deformation.
That's
Right, away from that. And so as we're all talking, I'm just thinking, we know what that is. Everybody knows what that is deep in them. Why are we doing this in the first place? Right. That experience.
Yeah.
Holding on to that, it feels elusive, right? It slips quickly through your fingers.
Yeah, I loved how you said the artistry, because the word I wanted to add onto that was the adventure of it all. Like I remember my first time teaching on my own, not a teaching fellow, not a this is me and the students, and yes, a little bit of nervousness, but there was something so an adventure for that. Like this is the first time I have been imagining myself doing this, pushing to do this. Now I get to actually have my own classroom adventure, right? So how do we retrieve that and use that energy to again reimagine these spaces and to create spaces for this newness of sound?
Which is very different than trying to get it right.
Yes.
Right. Or trying to get it like our mentors got it. Yeah. Right. To imagine yourself in these spaces and then go along and be taken up in these spaces and these encounters and these discoveries along with students, not lording over students. It's a fairly marvelous thing to participate in. So now, before we end the conversation, I want to make sure and get to a quote, because the quote scares me to death. Here's the quote. "And if you miss the sound of the genuine in you, you will be a cripple all the rest of your life, because you will never be able to get a scent on who you are." Mm. Now, those of us who know Thurman a little bit know this is quintessential Thurman.
All the way.
Right?
The challenge is up front.
The challenge is up front. Thurman don't pull no punches. If you do not, if you cannot hear inside of yourself, you will be a cripple.
And part of that, because I also recoil at that word, right? That's at that right. Language. It's in many ways, it's just such a loaded word. And if we think about his own personal history and time, but I also think what he does throughout this whole piece is tie the voice of the genuine to our ability to exercise agency, right? Mm-hmm. And so the use of even the language of disability. Yeah. And then later in the piece, he says, you'll be like a puppet with someone else pulling the strings, right? Because you don't have your own agency. You're just reactive to others pulling strings. And so, that's scary to think that if we don't connect to the sound of the genuine, then our agency, our ability to exercise our own lives, is really disabled. Yeah.
So many of Thurman's metaphors involve the body, right? Yeah. Into the life of the mind, where we want the luxury. It is a strange request. We want the luxury of being a neck up individual, right? Life of the mind, wherever, as if that doesn't involve the body, right? So now in the 21st century, when we know how vitally, critically important the body is to encounter and teaching and discovery and all those things, so many of Thurman's metaphors, like cripple, like you will be a puppet, are leading to understandings that who you are is as an incarnate being.
Shively,
our bodies.
Go back.
Our bodies are creating stories, telling stories, inviting stories. And I think Thurman got that our sound invites and creates space for the sounds of others to be made and to be articulated. And so it's not even just a personal experience of you being a puppet. For me, it is what happens if I don't, I love that, Amy, if I don't figure out my agency and figure out how to cut those strings of other people mapping onto me what they think, if I don't start claiming my own name, because if I don't, then there may be other Shiveleys in the room, in the classroom, who will not know that they have strings that they need to cut, or won't have the space to do that, to do that work. So I love his body images because it's not just about the individual. It really is about the relational and the proximity and the communal sounding off that can happen in our classrooms when we are naming and creating space for names to be articulated while we're teaching.
Mm-hmm. I remember early, I would get class, I'm thinking early in my teaching life, and there was kind of a podium. And so I could kick off my shoes and nobody could really tell. And I foot and again, that embodiment, Lynn, right? I felt grounded. I felt in my body. And uh, anyway, that just came to mind as we were talking. I'm not even sure it's relevant.
No, I
Well,
think it's relevant.
having a sense of being grounded in your own classroom rather than anxious and scared is
Mhm.
fairly important in how you occupy the space along with your students. So yes, it's actually very relevant.
And I'll tell you, building on the body's language, I have become very comfortable with creating space for my students to do what they need to do with their bodies in the classroom. I tend to like to teach these longer block courses. And so it was a new thing. It was actually kind of a scary thing initially, the first time I did it. But now it's a thing. I say, if you need to go stand against the wall while we're talking and
Mhm.
thinking, then do it, because I might move and go stand against the wall and talk. And there, that alone creates a different kind of space that I think is doing, in some ways, some of this body work that Thurman is pointing to with this, that could, in a different kind of way. I love it.
Early on in my teaching career, when I was reading the student evaluations, I say that as a senior person. I'm not encouraging people not to read their student evaluations, but one of the things that kept coming up in my student evaluations when students would talk back, about how the class was, it was akin to, "We love the way she dresses and her jewelry is so interesting."
Yes.
And in those moments, I was insulted. I'm like, I
Right.
am up here. I am a scholar. I am teaching. How dare they? Now that I'm a little older and a little wiser, to me, it just points to how important body is for them to relate to in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
Students want to have something to look at, right? It is as
Mhm.
much performance as it is an intellectual exercise. And that's not wrong, right?
Right.
So I remember gesturing at something in a very animated way and bracelets flying off across the class, earrings dropping
I
off.
love
So
it.
we're ducking in your
There she
classroom because
goes.
there she
At times,
goes.
at
Everybody
times.
duck.
Usually with something like, "Doc, we got it. Go ahead, keep going." I was in the middle of telling some tale, right? Telling some story, illuminating what topic I was
Right.
talking about.
Catch my earrings while I'm talking.
And I'll pop it back on and keep going, right? Keep going. But so we can pretend if we want to that body is not important in the classroom. The students are looking at our bodies. The students are
Yeah.
relating to our bodies
Mhm.
in very healthy and important ways, right? There's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that.
Yeah.
And I do want us to hear that Thurman, I think, is giving us a warning against a life that lives in constant reactivity. And I think our
Mm.
current social media environment is really cultivating and in many ways conditioning us to constantly be reacting to the latest headline, the latest tweet, what somebody
Mhm.
said. And when we're always in that reactive mode, we're giving them all the power to set the
That's
agenda
right.
for our lives, to set the agenda for how I'm going to use my time and energy. And I think that's one of the really important prophetic witnesses Thurman makes, is that if you're not grounded, then you're letting everybody else decide how you're going to spend your day.
And you can't hear. And then you can't hear inside yourself or outside yourself, right?
Amy, how do you think that for you, what is our role in the classroom in creating space that slows down, stops, mitigates, cuts off at the pass the reactivity that's coming into the room, either for ourselves as teachers or for our students? If we're all week long in these reactive modes, we come into the classroom, what is our role as professors and teachers in doing that work that you're talking about, cutting off that reactivity?
Because what we know now neurologically, from brain science and teaching science, is that folks aren't in a posture to learn. That in fact, it's not about just, throwing a fire hose of more information at them, that's not even how learning happens. But through slowing down and opening up spaces. So, starting class with let's just slow down and breathe a little bit and get our bodies in the room, get our whole selves in the room to be present to what we're learning, and then we can start to have, I think, more critical thinking, more creative thinking, and learning. And so it does mean, I think, changing the pace, the way we pace learning over an hour or 2 or 3 hour long classes, that allows for deeper engagement rather than wider.
I love that, deeper versus wider engagement. Yeah.
So I want to transition us to a practice that I witnessed and was a part of in the early 80s that I think might be helpful for us to kind of undergird and be able to hear Thurman when he's talking about the sound of the genuine. So I had been hired in the 80s to go into a local church. It was the Church of Gus Roman in Philadelphia, to consult with their Sunday school teachers. And as part of that consultation, I went to worship to get acquainted with the congregation, to see kind of what was happening in that local church. I walked into the sanctuary. I sat down in the sanctuary. It was a Baptist church. I'm very accustomed to being in Baptist churches. I was there as a consultant, but I also had planned on worshiping, right? I wasn't, when I went into the worship service, I didn't feel like I was on duty, right? I had gone there to worship with this congregation. The liturgy started, the choir, did a couple selections, the prayers had happened, all those kinds of things. And then Gus Roman, the pastor of the church, came to the microphone, and it was time, said the liturgy in the bulletin, for the pastoral prayer. And this is an example, a paraphrase of what he did when he came to the microphone. Pastor Roman went up to the microphone and he started this way, and then I'll continue to tell you what he said. This is the first thing he did. So after Pastor Roman took those 3 breaths into the microphone, he said, "It is prayer time. Breathe in and breathe out. Let yourself come fully into the sanctuary. Church, it is prayer time. Leave your concerns for a little while. It's prayer time. If you are a mother concerned about her children, release that concern for now and breathe. If you are a father worried about taking care of your family, let go of those concerns for now and breathe. If you are concerned about sickness or debt, it is prayer time. If you are afraid or anxious or filled with sorrow, it is prayer time. If you are in need of forgiveness, it is prayer time. Breathe in and breathe out. If you brought a bag full of concerns to the sanctuary, set it down. If you brought a busy mind, calm yourself. Breathe in the stillness. Let the stillness bubble up from inside. It is prayer time. Breathe in, still yourself, still the voices, dampen the confusions. Listen, for God speaks inside of you. Then Reverend Roman said, "Let us pray." The entire congregation by that time had stilled itself and prayed in silence for I don't know how long. At some point, Reverend Roman spoke into the microphone and offered a pastoral prayer. For how long, I don't know. But the lesson for me that day was the stilling oneself before you pray. And Shively, this is what you were talking about as individuals, but as entire communities, as entire congregations, as an entry into prayer. Not prayer stills you, but that you still yourself, right, to pray. It was an extraordinary experience for me.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
So are there things that you all notice about the practice that we might be able to reflect on? Or are there things that teachers might be challenged by in this practice, both individually and corporately?
Yeah. I think a challenge right immediately that's striking to me is we are not formed as teachers to think about what we're not going to do. We're formed to we form our classes and our syllabi around what we are going to do, the doing. You have to do this and this and this, and they have this. So what is it? I think that's some of the undoing that we need to do to see the classroom space as a space of of stillness and not doing, collective not doing, collective pausing, collective commitment, this collective commitment to calling a ceasefire on the reactionary tendencies and experiences that we've had up to that point. And that's a different way of thinking about our pedagogies and the ways in which we're setting up our classroom that I don't think we're formed to do, but that your practice is inviting me to think about as a challenge and an opportunity.
And what I notice is how attractive it is, how attractive as we pull into the stillness and as you had those invitations, each one after the other, to lay something down. I think that's actually easier to do in community than alone, that kind of stilling process. And as we get more and more deep into it, when you were done, it was like none of us wanted to say anything, right? We just kind of want to treasure, you just kind of want to hold that because it's magnetic and we just don't get it anywhere else in the culture. So that's what I notice about it. I think, it's challenging in that most professors don't think they're inviting students to pray, that this is a classroom, we're not coming to pray for the next hour, but I do think that's very adaptable language. And what I will often say to students in that kind of stilling exercise is breathe. There's nowhere else you need to be right now.
Yeah.
There's nothing else you need to be doing right now because we're all so conditioned to multitask, right? Breathe. You're right where you need to be right now. Breathe. Your to-do list from this morning, you can lay that down.
That's very helpful. I was particularly taken when Pastor Roman said, "Let us pray," right? that because I had thought we were praying, right? So when I think about, similar to what Amy, you were just doing, when I think about, well, how do we just verbally start our classes, whether we do a devotion or not, right? Sometimes devotion is appropriate, sometimes it's not. But rather than rush in with our own voices and saying, okay, the next thing we're going to do is, what would it be like? And I'm just echoing back, Amy, what you said. You don't have to pray with your students as much as you can calm them and still them with the intent of being present one to another.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I learned from that experience. So it's pretty. So it then makes sense. The questions about listening inside and outside then start to make sense, rather than the questions of listening and being together make sense then more than what are we going to do together.
Yeah. Yeah.
To Dr. Shively Smith and Dr. Amy Oden, I'm so looking forward to our next two conversations.
I am too. Can we do this again?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. And let us close with Howard Thurman's words. Dr. Thurman says, also in the same article, there is in every person that which waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in herself. There is that in every person that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in other people. And when these two sounds come together, this is the music God heard when God said, "Let us make humanity in our image." Ashe and amen.
Ashe and amen.
Ashe. Amen.
And we are out.